To Links to Learning this Tuesday afternoon. Hope everybody is doing well. My name is Michelle. I'm joining from Amiskwaciy, Waskagan, Edmonton Treaty 6 territory. I always feel like it's important to, honor and acknowledge the history, of the lands that you live on. I'm come from Treaty 4 territory, so I always say that I'm a guest to this land. So welcome. We're happy, honored that you chose to join us for this great presentation this afternoon. Just taking a moment, I always think it's really important just to take that moment to acknowledge, the goodness in this day. The sun here is shining. I always feel good in my heart when that sun is out. That we're surrounded by Creator's goodness. So just taking that moment to acknowledge, that there's love, there's, the beautiful animals, the waters, the plants, that all of our relations, we're surrounded by that goodness. So we just want to take a moment and just acknowledge and say thank you to Creator, gratitude from our heart center. All right, well, let's get on with today's presentation, shall we? I think it's gonna be a good one. We're glad that you could join us. So we're gonna talk about tourism. A conversation on post-COVID tourism, I think, is really important, as the world has opened up again in the last year or so. What's happening in the tourism industry? So we have Randy, who's joining us all the way from Florida, who's the former president of Walt Disney Travel Company and the executive VP of worldwide sales and travel operations for Disney's global travel portfolio. In conversation with Shae Bird, who is the CEO of Indigenous Tourism Canada, and they're going to share their thoughts on what the tourism sector in Canada, what we can expect post-COVID. So there will also be, for those of you who have joined us, opportunity for, questions that you might have. So this is the time, this is the platform to bring those questions and your curiosity to the table. So we're glad you're here. I'm just going to hand over the virtual mic right away. I'm going to take myself off video, and I may see you at the end. I'm just letting you know I'm on 15% on my Mac here. So my bad, forgot my charger. Who does that? So take it away. Thank you so much, Randy and Shae, for being here, lending us your very valuable time. We really honor and appreciate, your voice, your thoughts, your wisdom, and the knowledge that you carry around this important topic of tourism. So I'm passing this virtual mic over to you.
Before I let Shae's going to actually be the MC here, I think it's important for you to know, you heard about my career at Disney. I definitely have deep roots in Canada. I am a Canadian Tourism Commissioner. I sit on the board of Destination Canada, and I also sit on the board of Rocky Mountaineer. And while I'm not representing either one of those companies today, I'm speaking solely as a private individual. I pull my knowledge and experience from those engagements as well. It's all yours, Shae.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Randy, and thank you, Michelle. It is such a pleasure to be here. My name is Shae Bird, as Michelle mentioned. I do want to highlight I'm the CEO of Indigenous Tourism Alberta. I'm not taking Keith Henry's job anytime soon, at least as far as I know. But I do represent the province of Alberta and the Indigenous tourism businesses within it. And I am also coming from Edmonton on Treaty 6 territory, Métis Region 4, which I call home. So yeah, so nice to be here. And Randy, let's kick it off here. When we start talking about, obviously we've had some really interesting impacts with COVID and really a complete halt to the travel industry. When we talk about business travel, commercial travel segments, this makes up a lot of the revenues Canada sees, and I'm just wondering from your perspective, when do you see that business travel kind of revamping and getting back to those pre-pandemic levels? And are they going to? Are we almost there? I'd just love to know your thoughts on that.
Well, first of all, the business travel market is much slower to recover in general. And if you think about this, companies have chief financial officers or people who are managing their budgets, and they may have been misled by our reliance on Zoom and Teams and everything else, to think that salespeople don't need to be out in the field anymore, to think that people can attend conferences and trade shows and training activities remotely. And quite honestly, while there's some efficiencies, there's nothing that replaces personal contact where you're dealing face to face. For business events in particular, sales activity and leads are now at the highest level since the pandemic began. But remember, the pandemic really began with its recognition of it in March of 20. So you're almost 3 years from when it started. But we do continue to lag well behind 2019. And this segment doesn't expect a full recovery until 2026. Okay. A lot of positive activity is being seen in booking for 2023 is due to business events from during COVID that were moved. There were a lot of activities, trade shows, conventions that just got pushed into the future. So those were moved. Booking rates for international events coming to Canada for 2024 through 2026 are presently only at 56% of what they were pre-pandemic. So it's going to be slower. And quite honestly, don't know if it'll actually recover to that level, but everybody uses 2019 really as the benchmark when comparing things rather than 20, 21, et cetera, because that was the last full year of pre-pandemic conditions.
Yeah, no, that's really good points. And, I wonder, in your opinion, because Indigenous Tourism Alberta, we are in the business of bidding on events, but obviously regional DMOs, that's a big part of actually getting those business events to major cities throughout the country. And what did that bid process look like when we had the unfortunate layoffs and people couldn't actually keep their businesses, whether it's the DMOs, and have those staffing to do it, right? So I would imagine there's a chunk of time where we'd be bidding on events for 23, 24, that the staff capacity to do so probably wasn't even there.
Well, you also have to consider the fact that the operators, not only the operators in the convention and meeting facilities, but in the hotels, there's huge staffing shortages. Well, I don't know if they've run this kind of survey in Canada, but I know the American Hotel Lodging Association basically said that over 80% of the hotel operators said they were short-staffed.
Yeah.
So when you're short-staffed, it's kind of like, even in the cruise industry, there's some vessels that are out there that are, talking about high occupancy, but they're not offering the same number of staterooms. So, if you've got a vessel that had, 600 staterooms, and in order to operate at 100%, you needed 600 booked. Now you're at 400 staterooms because you don't have the housekeeping staff, the wait staff, and everything else to operate all 600. So when they're forecasting occupancy, they're forecasting it actually at a lower level because they're forecasting it based on the 400, not the 600. Now, that may not be true of every cruise line and every hotel company, but I certainly know many have pulled back on the inventory that they're selling because they want to provide a great guest experience. And if they can't staff, it's no different really than some of the restaurants in my Canadian hometown of Stratford, where they're not operating 5 or 6 days a week. Some of them are operating only 4 days a week. And some operators who had multiple restaurants have kind of consolidated their staff in one and closed one of the ones that they didn't have the people for.
Absolutely. And I think we're definitely seeing that in Canada, certainly in Alberta, with, hotels saying they're at their capacity, but really it's at their staff capacity, not their room capacity. And that staff and labor shortage is such a challenge because we know we could have more people in the accommodation, in terms of consumers and business travel and those type of things. But, to your point, you want to provide that high level or quality guest experience. And if you don't have the staff to do so, you might be shooting yourself in the foot a little bit if you're providing, a mediocre experience just to try and fill more rooms. And, I think those are some of the challenges that we see coming out of COVID and what the future post COVID may look at. I know for myself, labor is my biggest concern for the tourism sector right now, in ensuring that are we going to have staff to actually work the jobs with pent up demand for consumer travel, right? Or like the skill sets. I know even just the sentiment towards working in the tourism industry, because a lot of these people, they got laid off and they found new positions elsewhere because they had to put food on their table, right? But now they're in other industries, they're in other roles, and they're not necessarily coming back. So, with that, what are some of your, kind of highlights of your biggest concerns moving into the tourism industry on a post-COVID or post-pandemic world for Canada?
Well, up until a few months ago, I would not have talked about the airline industry, but the airline industry is also a concern. And I've seen that come up in some of the research recently because of the situation that developed at Vancouver. And people understand in the winter when you've got inclement weather, but they don't understand it when the weather's not a factor. Okay. And in the US, the Federal Aviation Administration on one day shut down the entire air traffic control system. Southwest Airlines in the US couldn't staff. So, and then of course, what happened in Vancouver and Toronto. So I think there's an apprehension level to a certain extent about people traveling by air and worrying about whether or not they're actually going to make it to their destination and will their bags be delivered. Okay, so that's one issue that really, if you'd asked me 3 or 4 months ago, I would not have surfaced. But it's one that, as a result of aberrational operations, is front and center on a lot of people's minds. The last 3 years have obviously been really difficult for many parts of our sector. We've lost a lot of talented people, not only in frontline jobs, we've lost them in management roles.
Absolutely.
So one of the biggest challenges facing our industry is really a labor shortage.
Yeah.
Our industry's job vacancy rate is almost 2 percentage points higher than the rate in the overall Canadian economy. With historically low unemployment rates, we're competing for talent like never before.
Yeah.
I've seen a lot of companies that I would call talent magnets that never had to pay bonuses or any kind of do really tremendous marketing to try to recruit talent. They're doing that now. This impacts the ability not only to remain open, like Shae said, to full capacity, stretching current staff members' workloads, and in some cases, likely diminishing service levels, which is why the operators have cut back, because at the end of the day, the best marketing is positive word of mouth, net promoter scores. So you're better to offer fewer operating hours and fewer rooms and deliver the normal good service levels than you would be to stretch yourself even further, but fall short. Most of us who spend time in this industry, it's under commit and over deliver, not the other way around.
Absolutely.
So we're continuing to build a coordinated, concerted effort to place tourism as a destination for employment and show that the demand for employees is far outpacing supply. And we will be working closely with our partners, at least Destination Canada will, at Tourism HR Canada on their upcoming campaign to raise awareness. You see the impacts everywhere. Just as an example, 50% of all airport workers in Canada have only been on the job for less than a year. Think about that. You think about on-the-job training, you think about how that experience, improves your capabilities and your performance. They're really in slightly, for those that have companies with probationary periods, many of them are still in the probationary period, but they're certainly on a steep learning curve. And that's a staggering figure that helps explain the challenges the industry is facing.
With that as well, I think something that we see, mentioning the airline challenge is a lot of people default to the airline itself, but the operational piece of the airports, right? The airports, to your point, if say 30 to 50% of the people and the baggage and the security and just the operational people on the ground at these airports are in that preliminary stages of their position, obviously there's going to be less efficiency in terms of moving people through that gateway onto that airline, right?
Absolutely. I mean, you think about the whole process. If you're flying outbound, you get to the airport, you got to go through security. You hope that the check-in process is, reasonable. Okay. And then you fly. And when you get to your destination, your bags got to be delivered unless you just did carry on. And then, okay, what about the transportation from the airport to wherever your next destination is? And are you connecting in an airport and just waiting to get on another plane? So there's so many factors. And you're right, people have this tendency to focus on the carrier themselves instead of recognizing all the ancillary services that support that carrier, whether it's fuel, whether it's provisioning of food, cleaning the aircraft. There's tons of different jobs at the airport that are not airline jobs, but they're airport jobs. And
Absolutely. And critical.
They're all impacted. They all touch the experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it is important to highlight that it's not like we were in a surplus of tourism employees or potential tourism talent out there pre-COVID. We were still looking for people to work in the tourism space. There was still a labor shortage pre-COVID, clearly not to the levels we're at now. But it wasn't like we were starting with this massive surplus of talent. The odds were a little bit against us in terms of looking at the tourism industry, at least from the Canadian side in Alberta, pre-COVID. So it really amplified everything with, everything else that happened.
Plus, I would say to you too, that some of the more distant parts of the country, whether it's the territories on the western part of Canada or the Atlantic provinces, have seen dramatic reductions in airline service. So, even if they are fully staffed at a hotel, they're reliant on the airline delivering a large volume of their demand. And until that schedule is reinstated, there's really a direct impact on their ability to hit their volume numbers.
Absolutely. A good friend of mine, James Jackson, he's the CEO of Tourism Jasper. He has this quote, I'm probably butchering it, but he used to say that, our biggest challenge out of COVID isn't going to be gaining back the consumers, it's going to be gaining the employees or marketing to the employees to get people to fill the jobs as opposed to the consumers because of that pent up demand. And I think we are seeing pent up demand. I know certainly we're seeing some of the international markets open back up now with airflow. Obviously, there's certain markets that aren't opened up, China, for example, but a lot of those European markets, US markets, we're starting to see that come back a bit. How do you see Canada positioned to re-enter some of these US or international markets and gaining back that market share that we kind of all lost over COVID and kind of shook the Etch-a-Sketch and starting from square one again?
Well, first of all, let me give you some context for this because I've been in the travel business for a long time. And there's been an incident almost every decade, whether it was the Gulf War, whether it was the gas shortage, whether it was a global economic recession, whether it was 9/11, whether it directly affects Canada or not, it certainly impacts how people think about travel. And this last couple of years, Canada was very effective in domestic tourism, okay, because we got Canadians to travel within the country because many of them didn't want to deal with the issues of leaving the country and being tested and coming back into the country, being vaccinated, etc. So domestic tourism was very, very strong the last couple of years because that was really one of the only options that people had. The other thing I would say, and I will answer your question about international, is that every time there's been a disruption in travel, when people resume travel, they resume travel like concentric circles. It's like if you threw a rock in a pond, okay, and you see the circles go out. First, you're going to see local tourism. Then you're going to see local distant tourism. And by that, I mean really people that don't have to overnight, but can make day trips to a destination. Then you start to see regional domestic tourism. Then you start to see national domestic tourism. The national domestic tourism is somebody going from Toronto to Vancouver. And then finally, you start to see international tourism. But even then, you see short haul first, which would be the United States, really. And then you start to see long haul, which is transatlantic and trans-Pacific. So that has been the norm, honestly, for every disruption that I've ever experienced and the resumption of business. Canada has a very strong nation brand, but we need Canada to stand out from the crowd as a travel destination and be noticed in a sea of sameness and a fiercely competitive travel marketplace. And I say that because most of us only see the advertising we see in our home markets, our source markets, but you don't see the advertising that's taking place in Sydney, Australia. You don't see the advertising that's taking place in China when China opens. You don't see it in France. You don't see it in the United Kingdom. So in the years that I was leading Disney's sales efforts, I always was trying to show our leaders what was taking place because we were in fierce competition from the same visitor with countries all over the world who were funded far more aggressively than we were, whether it was Disney or the United States. So through a comprehensive competitive review, Canada looked for ways to talk about Canada and brand attributes that feel real and true, that feel different from other places, and that are compelling reasons to visit Canada in the eyes of potential visitors. Indigenous tourism is a key part of that. Canada's openness is at the core of who we are, from our open minds that fuel refreshing perspectives to our open hearts that foster a sense of belonging, and of course, the open spaces that inspire a sense of freedom and renewal. That's Canada's brand strategy that underpins their global marketing. But at the end of the day, it comes down to dollars and cents, okay? And one of the things that a lot of people don't really recognize when they're looking at things like this is that the spending is impacted by foreign exchange, because when you're buying time in the United States, or you're buying advertising, or you're buying it in another country, you're buying it in their local currency. So if your currency has been adversely impacted and it's not worth as much in American dollars or some other currency, you can't buy as much. That's before the impact of inflation. So you literally have the double whammy, so to speak, of it costing more to advertise in many of, actually it costs more to advertise wherever you are in the world just because of inflation. And then you factor in on top of it, foreign exchange. So believe me, as part of this board, I'm in there trying to persuade the Canadian government as well as our Minister of Tourism to say, hey, look, even if you give us the same amount of money you gave us before, it's not going to buy as big a share of voice as it did before, just because of those two factors I mentioned.
Yeah, absolutely. Great points. And, I think it's important that we advocate to our provincial and federal partners at the table to say, look at the budgets that we're up against, right? And then look at the impacts of inflation and how far does that dollar really go when we're talking about global competition and being that global competitor as a destination. We're talking a lot about the challenges. I think we all know we have some pretty significant challenges coming out of this, but I'd love to have your insight of, as we move forward in a brighter light, like what are some strengths that we have as a destination here in Canada, and what are we seeing good that's happening in terms of how we're recovering out of COVID?
Well, we have what I would call an embarrassment of riches, and a welcoming population of people who, are friendly, and we're on sale. The challenge that I mentioned with trying to spend money in foreign countries to generate marketing exposure, the opposite side of that is if you generate the marketing exposure, we're on sale because the other countries' currencies have improved against Canadian dollars. So that's a very positive thing. And it's one which, is part of the argument that I make, which is, my God, when our dollar is weak versus other countries, we should be putting the pedal to the metal and even marketing more aggressively because we're a better value. Okay. Mm-hmm. So, Canada's reputation is really, second to none. And as you can see, my backdrop here is Chateau Lake Louise. Go find that someplace else in the world and, that accessible. So we've got so many places that are just not only beautiful during their peak, but we've got a portfolio where something's always at its peak, really. And, whether it's, the winters in Churchill and Manitoba, or, the summers in other parts of the country where, the weather's hard to beat. I mean, Canada's got a really, I call it an embarrassment of riches because, we have wonderful products, great people, a safe environment where people feel welcome. Those are all gigantic benefits, but they're not going to be, the awareness of those things takes marketing dollars.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, that's a great point. I think, we've seen certain, provinces and the country really focus on the landscapes and, the beautiful scenery we have geographically across the country and the diversity of that geography. But I really think that Indigenous tourism has that key to increase that competitive advantage piece as a global destination. Because, we see pre-COVID, Indigenous tourism was the fastest growing sector within the tourism industry. We saw it as the fastest or the largest demand product for tourism in the country as well. Some of our key markets like France, 65% of travelers coming from France want that Indigenous tourism experience. UK, US, Japan, you name it, there's that demand level. And, with the beautiful scenery, we have the beautiful Rockies, for example, but there's also the Swiss Alps. There's also, the mountains in Argentina and South America. Like there's a lot of beautiful landscape out there when we're talking about global competitive advantage. And if a consumer is like, I can go anywhere in the world, where am I choosing? But the thing that Canada can't be replicated is that Indigenous culture and that story and the history and the Indigenous people that called this land traditional territory for years immemorial. And we look at places like Europe where we can see visibly the history in terms of the architecture, the cobble streets, all these type of things, the plate on the bar in England that says established in 1802. Our history in Canada is that Indigenous story, and it's not provided through the architecture, it's provided through the Indigenous people and the cultural experiences and the elders and the knowledge keepers and the youth that are claiming that. And I think that's something as a country we can really double down on in terms of the fabric of who we are as Canadians being on traditional territory. I can speak on this for hours, obviously, this is what I am passionate and work on. But from your perspective, where does Indigenous tourism play in the overall tourism landscape for Canada?
Well, it's a unique differentiator for sure. A strong Indigenous tourism industry is vitally important to the overall visitor economy in Canada, providing significant economic growth and stability across urban and rural communities. Where welcomed, Indigenous tourism can also help revitalize cultures and languages, celebrate music, song and dance, share stories, art, cuisine, and also elevate national pride. Prior to the global pandemic, Indigenous tourism employed about 39,000 employees and brought an estimated 1.86 billion Canadian dollars in direct GDP. This is from ITEC. We see the opportunity of Indigenous tourism in every part of the country. We also see the opportunity to support and grow the industry from coast to coast in particular. There's a strong opportunity for Indigenous tourism in the US market. As we know, 40% of Americans are interested in having an Indigenous experience while they're in Canada. The Destination Canada, the Canadian Tourism Commission, strengthened our commitment to the Indigenous Tourism Association of Canada through a 5-year memorandum of understanding, which will help propel the recovery and the resilience of Canada's Indigenous tourism business and communities, and hopefully contribute to reconciliation.
I, absolutely. And, I think when it comes to Indigenous tourism, if we're talking the economics, it clearly has a argument for the economics. With just the job growth, the business growth, the employment, full-time employment, all those type of things, visitation. But I think the power of Indigenous tourism is really those social benefits, right? The language revitalization, revenues going back to community to support whatever that community needs in terms of growth and the education piece, engaging youth and elders and providing a platform to share. Like, as you'll see from Indigenous Tourism Alberta's new branding that we just put out, a lot of it is all based on it's an invitation. It's an invitation to come share. It's an invitation to come eat with us, come drink with us, come dance with us, and really bring you into that authentic experience that, Indigenous tourism, it starts with the voice of those operators and sharing their experiences the way that they want their story to be told. And I think that's a key piece as well, is that having that Indigenous-led approach and ensuring that, when it comes to truth and reconciliation, which I think is that third pillar within, the outputs or byproduct of Indigenous tourism, that starts with truth. And I can't think of a better landscape than having that authentic truth shared through those Indigenous tourism operators in an environment that is really created to educate the visitor and consumer, whether it's domestic or international, to learn a little bit more about the traditional roots and really fabric of what Canada is, or what we now call as Canada. And I think
it's interesting to me. I've been in the tourism industry a long time. And one of the things that's kept me involved and really powered my interest has been that I really believe that tourism's a force for world peace. Okay. From the time I was a young person, really, as people travel, they become more aware of diversity. They become more aware of cultural and religious differences, and they become more accepting. Okay. And I can tell you, just in survey research, that people's perceptions of a country before they visit are usually shaped more by media and politics. When they finally get to a country and they recognize the warmth of the people and their personal experience, no matter what their opinion was pre-arrival, it improves, really. And you think about some other countries that were closed off really to tourism over the last 40 years, whether it was mainland China, whether it was South Africa during apartheid. And then you see what's occurring and how tourism there has changed not only the brand of those countries, but it's diversified their economies. It's created a lot more different jobs. And it's, from an economic development, it's created economic development. So I learned a long time ago, as I was a really young person traveling, that I had a lot more in common with people than I did differences. But I had to learn that by visiting and then enjoying their culture, their religions, their practices, and just opening my mind. So that's then what has been my driving force behind staying in this industry, is I realized that as people just travel, they become more tolerant, they become more respectful, they become more aware of diversity, and they celebrate the similarities and the differences, both.
Absolutely. No, I think you put it well, that ever evolving perception and perspective on your surroundings. And it's interesting because when COVID first hit, obviously the largest impact was those international travelers. And the challenge that we had for the Indigenous tourism sector specifically is we had better sentiment from our international travelers for Indigenous tourism experiences than we did Canadians in our own backyard. And I think, it really provided a need and opportunity to re just engage our domestic consumers and say, hey, we have cultural experiences in our own backyard that you may not know of, and you actually live on that traditional territory. And when we talk about Indigenous as well, I think we still come across very frequently this idea of like pan-Indigenous, where it's all the same in Canada. And we have such a diversity just in Alberta of varying cultures with different protocols, stories, history. And, I like to think of it as almost like, at least when I'm talking to non-Indigenous people, so it's easy to relate it, but thinking of like Europe is made up of all these countries so close together, and they're all so different, but they're all in one area. And Indigenous cultures are no different. They're so different with all their different nations and cultures and populations, and also how they navigated traditionally throughout their regions. And we need to, I think, really work on helping share that story more authentically through that Indigenous voice and through those Indigenous tourism operators, so we can help the world and also our Canadian residents here in Canada that there's those significant cultural experiences that aren't necessarily usual to yourself. It's very unique, and just as different as me going to a hill tribe in Thailand, me going to a powwow on Blackfoot country is going to be such a different experience. And you don't necessarily need to travel a far distance to have these type of really meaningful cultural experiences. Plus, you'll get to learn a little bit about the traditional territory that you either live on or that is a part of what we now know as Canada.
Well, it's interesting. I grew up in New York, okay? And while I've been married to a Canadian for years, have a home in Canada, and have worked in that tourism industry, as a child or as a young person in New York, I never went to the Statue of Liberty. I never went to the Empire State Building. I never took a circle tour around Manhattan. I had to leave and be gone for decades before I came back to experience that. And the same is true in Canada. Many people have a love-hate relationship with tourism. They like the economic development, but if there's traffic on the highways that's caused by visitors, they don't like that. They don't like the fact they can't get a restaurant reservation. So, and many times, I think of my hometown in Stratford. If you look at Stratford, which is a population of 32,000 and accommodates over 500,000 people a year that comes to the Stratford Festival, when the festival's in town, you're not going to be able to get a dinner reservation, believe me, because everybody's eating between 5:30 and 7:30 at night before the theaters, okay? But what the locals don't necessarily appreciate and recognize is the broad spectrum of restaurants that would not be there if it weren't for tourism. Those restaurants, while you get to enjoy them after the tourists leave, okay, they couldn't sustain themselves. You see the tax dollars that are coming into a community and what it does for beautification. You see the galleries and all the different businesses that are there to take advantage of the visitors. They wouldn't be there. And while people have a tendency to just focus on what I would call the top line, most visible stuff, they don't realize that, towels, pillowcases, the laundry that's being, outsourced from a hotel or a restaurant. They don't realize the food that's being consumed in the restaurants may be coming, is another element of the economic development. So it really is. And that's not unique to Canada. It really isn't. I don't care where you live. If you live in Orlando, where Disney operated, there's a lot of residents in Orlando who think, oh my God, the tourists are here again. I remember every time I used to see a British person who was having challenges trying to figure out what side of the road to drive on, I kept going, well, thank you. You're helping pay my salary and you're reducing my tax burden through your visitation. Mm-hmm. So that love-hate relationship that locals have with tourists, I swear is worldwide. And even if you look this last 2 years in Venice, how the natural environment of the waters in Venice improved dramatically because there were no ships. So, you know, it's an interesting scenario. I think we have to raise people's awareness of the benefits. They already know the challenges of tourism. They already see the things that they don't like, but they don't realize how many of the benefits of their lifestyle are driven by tourism and visitor economy and their spending.
Absolutely. No, I couldn't agree with you more. And it, like, we call it a economy of economies for a reason, right? It's the visitor economy. It's all interconnected. It's so diverse in the nature of what it does, right? You know, before we move on to a bit of a Q&A, we got about 19 minutes here. I'm going to ask you a couple quick questions. One is, off the top of your head, what's something that you learned from COVID and hope that, you know, we can take that into the future of tourism for Canada? And what's one thing that you learned from COVID that hopefully we kind of leave behind that with how we reshape tourism here in Canada?
Well, one of the things I learned, and I don't know if this is on either side of the issue you just mentioned, I think a lot of companies adjusted their operations to accommodate, you know, additional healthcare concerns. Whether it was, you know, the check-in in a lobby is now, you know, really, you know, touchless. Okay. Whether it was, no, you know, you want to eat, it's grab and go. Okay. Whether it's, geez, we don't have housekeeping because we don't have enough housekeepers. So we're either not providing it to you or we're providing it to you on request every second or third day. So there were a lot of features and amenities and benefits that were adjusted during COVID. And then as inflation started to hit, the price of visitor experiences started to escalate. And in many cases, the operators who saw these efficiencies by reducing their operational offerings have kept the reduction in place. Mm-hmm. So a consumer is looking at this and going, wait a minute, I'm paying more and I'm getting less. And I worry about that. And I would hope that the operators are, you know, looking at that and saying, wait a minute, I got to go back. I don't have the air cover of a health and safety environment anymore. Now, you know, buffets, if you think about this, whether it's on a cruise ship or in a hotel, nobody got to self-serve on buffets anymore. You could walk around, but there would be somebody behind the counter spooning out the food for you. That's not a problem, really. You know, the quality of the meals didn't change. The amount of food you could buy didn't change. So that's something that took place that, quite honestly, was a positive outcome, I think, in many respects, at least on the buffet level. You know, touchless check-in, if you wanted it, is also a potential benefit, but it shouldn't be forced on you, okay? I mean, I stayed at a beautiful resort last summer where all my communication with the staff there was by text. And I thought to myself, I really want to see somebody. I want to, you know, I don't want to do this by text. And I'm reasonably adept on using electronic technology. But I thought to myself, there's a lot of people who aren't comfortable with it and want to pick up a room phone or want to, you know, just use their cell phone and call somebody on the front desk. Or so, you know, I think operators need to be very attentive to the changes they made and which ones are sustainable, and which ones are really just a temporary thing that was put in place to accommodate enhanced health focus, but no longer makes sense.
Absolutely. No, I love those points. And for someone that travels for work incredibly often, I'm noticing that not a lot of hotels do room service anymore. And when I fly in late at night and I'm like, I just want to have a meal and go to bed, and I don't want to have to go down to a restaurant or find somewhere else, it's not there anymore. And that it doesn't mean that I'm paying any less for the rooms, that's for sure. So I think you're right. You know, that we've certainly adapted in ways and kind of kept that going to offset some of these other challenges like inflation and staff and those type of things. You know, for me on the consumer side, I think something that I've seen a shift in the consumers, but I think just in general in people is the understanding of the importance of connection and the connection with people, and what that does to us when we don't have that connection, when we don't have that face-to-face communication. And we've seen it certainly from a business perspective, you know, the impacts of having things like this virtually as opposed to in person, or being able to have those important meetings, or even just, you know, talk around the water cooler type thing, you know, those interactions that kind of fill the social your social level a little bit. But also I think when we look at consumer trends for tourism products, we're seeing more people want more immersive kind of cultural perspective shifting experiences, and a more of those one-on-one, or just more you know, interactive experiences with the human beings, you know, with the people that live there, with the culture. And I think that is a shift in the right direction. I personally really like that. You know, I think to all the times, and again, that could be just how I travel. But certainly a big part of why I travel when I'm doing it for leisure is to connect with the people there, and learn the cultural differences and build those relationships. Because I think relationship is so important, regardless whether it's personal or business, or you know, as a consumer and a tourism destination. So as we continue to see consumers looking for that one-on-one connection and those human connections for those experiences, I think it's going to create a bit of a perspective shift with those individuals when they're traveling and when they leave. And, you know, I think to myself, you know, if you have someone that connects with an elder with an Indigenous experience, for example, and they talk about the importance of elders in their community, you leave that and you're not only moved by that, but you're like, I should probably call my grandma. I haven't talked to my grandma in a month. I should probably call her and see how she's doing. And, you know, I think if we can have these type of experiences that we bring back to our own lives, it could put us in a pretty cool situation going back to reality.
Well, you know, I completely agree with you. Relationships have been my oxygen in life. Okay. And when COVID hit, the time we needed them most, they were not there. Okay. So I made a concerted effort in the absence of face-to-face contact to at least utilize, you know, telephone, utilize, you know, Zoom or Teams or FaceTime to connect with people. They were a poor substitute for face-to-face, you know, individual connection, but at least they were a substitute. Okay.
Absolutely.
But I now recognize that, okay, I want to go back to the norm. I want to go back. I want to feel that handshake. I want to look in somebody's eyes. You know, all the years that I was working and leading large teams, I always told my staff that face-to-face communication is by far the most effective. Okay. If you can't talk to somebody so you can see their face, you can look at them, you know, their reactions and stuff, speak to them on the phone. If you can't do that, then you can resort to texting or emails or whatever. But by far, the most effective communication is face-to-face. Now, granted, I had people all over the world. I couldn't necessarily see them all, you know, all the time, but I did travel extensively around the world to see them, you know, a couple of times a year, because it's very difficult to establish relationships with someone you've never met electronically. Okay. it's a lot easier to sustain and nurture them once they've been established, but it's very difficult to start from scratch.
Absolutely. Awesome,
I
man.
see you got a hand up. Bonnie's got a hand up.
Yes, Bonnie.
Well, thank you so much for presenting. I think that your backgrounds, both of you, have really enlightened how far one can take the extra steps for tourism and enticing those to come, create repeat business. I wanted to ask, did you have the ability to touch base on going the extra mile in regards to various cultures that are coming and how to attract them? Because on an Aboriginal side here in Canada, it's very important to address, Tansy and say different languages or have it in their spelling. How far do you advise someone to go? I've been to the Hawaiian Disney hotels and they've got the Hawaiian wording and it just seems culturally sensitive. How far do you expect other hotels to go to show that they care about various cultures?
It's up to the individual operator, but I was involved from the inception. And, the Polynesian culture was very critical to us at the time. And we put together an advisory team because I'll give you a perfect illustration of this. In those days, Disney would not allow visible tattoos. But in Polynesian culture, that type of marking is very critical, and it's embedded in their culture from an early age. So we modified the policies. Okay, if you look at the artwork around that hotel, it all came as a result of the input we got from the local advisory board, and it was local artists. Okay, so for us, it was critical. I can't speak to the actual hotels around the country because it depends who their target audience is. It goes back to years ago, even in Florida, when the Japanese market first opened and people were trying to attract Japanese visitors. They needed to put slippers in the rooms. They needed to put mats down. They needed to have tea. They needed to change a breakfast offering so that individuals from Japan felt more comfortable. The hotels and the tourism facilities throughout the country need to make individual decisions on, what they can afford, what they need to do to reflect not only the visitors, but to not destroy the offering of what makes them unique in the destination that they're on. So it's a kind of a combination, but it's enhanced sensitivity to what are the expectations of the visitor when they arrive, and what are we operationally able to offer. What do you think, Shae?
Yeah, so I'm gonna come about it a little. Sorry, I'm kind of trying to run away from the sun that's slowly chasing me down. I'm gonna probably come across it with a bit of a less economical perspective and say I think it's a bit of a responsibility of a lot of our non-Indigenous tourism businesses, to acknowledge the traditional territory they're on and doing so in some way with whether it's having language, whether it's having land acknowledgements on little cards in every hotel room, whether it's having traditional welcomes, whatever it may be. I think it's going to be a bit of a case by case based on, the nations in which those traditional territories are on, and obviously relationship with those nations and those community members. But in my opinion, like, Indigenous tourism is scraping the surface. I am hoping that Alberta and Canada overall, it becomes the global premier Indigenous tourism destination. And in doing so, that includes creating a sense of place that from the second you land on the runway, you're not only getting welcome to Calgary, you're getting welcome to Mohkinstsis on Treaty 7 territory in Métis Region 3 said to you on the plane. I want there to be visible representation as you're getting off the plane in the airport with airport staff. There needs to be more language in signage, whether it's billboards, street signs, public art. We need to do a better job at creating a sense of place, inclusive sense of place that equally represents the Indigenous population in which we call this area traditional territory. And I think we're in the start of that in terms of some of our strategic partnerships and working with hoteliers and different operators. But in my opinion, there's so much more that can be done, and you know, we're nowhere near where my expectations of what I would like to see, because we have to remember, you know, think if you're an Indigenous person, you go into an airport and you see all the check-in people are non-Indigenous, then you go through security and all the check-in people are non-Indigenous security people, and that can be intimidating. Like, I think as a Indigenous country that is now known as Canada, we need to have better representation throughout the job positions, but also just visibly through language and those varying things. And then I also just want to highlight that there are countries that they do this a lot better in the terms of visibility, but doesn't necessarily mean that it's going back economically or socially to the Indigenous community itself. I think that's a key piece that we need to consider, or not consider. We have to acknowledge that if we are providing Indigenous content as a non-Indigenous business, organization, corporation, we need to ensure that there's some type of funnel where that's supporting the local community. Because if you're not doing that, in my opinion, it's not authentic, and you're really just capitalizing on market demand, but you're not doing it for the right reasons. And I think all that starts, it's not a one shoe fits all answer, but I think it starts with relationship. And what we're seeing here in Alberta is a lot of our non-Indigenous partners, they don't have relationship with community. And that's the first step. So we create programs to try and facilitate platforms and provide tools to facilitate the initiation of that relationship with community members, educate, and ideally get that relationship to a place where it can turn into a transaction down the road. But we have to acknowledge that relationship starts with a relationship, not a transaction. And that's incredibly important from the Indigenous perspective. So I think, you know, to answer your question very long-windedly, we're at the beginning of it, but there's a long ways to go. And I think the first step is just creating better relationship with community and urban Indigenous and just the Indigenous population overall, understanding the cultural components and working with non-Indigenous partners to not say, we want to do this, are you okay with that? But saying, we want to tell your story in a way that, or we want to help you share your story. How would you like that represented? Bring them to the table and allow them to represent their story, their culture in a way that they feel is authentic, safe, and appropriate, and go from there.
Yeah, thank you so much. It sounds like there are a couple of takeaways there, such as it depends on your market share. If you are living in a $1.2 million or million population, your market share might be or just corporate seminars, and then, you know, a small amount of Indigenous or the lands that, if there's a treaty acknowledgement, and then, you know, keep it just even keel. But if you're in a smaller rural community, you network with the community, get people together so that everybody supports each other. You know, if there's a fire, that every hotel comes to support the people. And so make sure that there's a community connection and add the culture that you have in place to your hotel or tourism base. So it depends on what type of demographics you have, but still including it is really empowering, right?
And who you're trying to attract.
Yes, the market.
It's not just the demographics on the front end. It's, okay, who's your target audience?
Target audience, right? Yeah, that's what I meant. Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Bonnie. And thank you, Shae, for facilitating today's session. And Randy, thank you so much for your time. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. And we'll have another session next Tuesday. Hope you all have
My
a great
pleasure.
afternoon.
Awesome.
Thank you so
Thanks a
much.
lot.